Hey, hello everyone. Thanks so much for you that are in the room, for all of our guests, and also for all of those that are joining in from online. And a million thanks also to our speakers today that have been flying to Brussels for a big conference on Beyond Growth. Before I introduce you to them, just a bit of housekeeping. For those of you that are joining online, there is a chat function just at the bottom of your screen. I'll monitor that. So if you do pop your questions in there, we can then address them later. And for those of you in the room, you can just raise your hand. I think the panel will take place in a set of questions. There will be no PowerPoint presentation. So also, if you do have any questions, also among yourselves, please free to just jump in and have a bit of an informal chat as well. So we have online our first speaker, Eloi Laurent. He's professor at Sciences Po Paris and also at Stanford University. We have Béla Galgóczi, that is at the very end of the table. He is senior researcher here at the Trade Union Institute. Hirvilammi, senior research fellow at Tampere University, and Paolo Graziano, he's professor of political science at the University of Padua. So Eloi, if that's okay with you, I would start with you that you are afar, and I have a very simple question to open up that probably would take much more than 5 minutes to answer, but if we could keep it concise, that would be excellent. So, to what extent, if at all, the welfare state is dependent on growth?
Okay, so first of all, good morning. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much to so hello to other panelists, and thank you very much for ETUI for organizing this conference. I think that when the European Union finally moves to a social ecological model that is compatible with the 21st century and leaves behind, you know, the fantasy of 20th century economics, I think ETUI will have a special place in really fostering this shift with all those great conferences and papers and, you know, just putting this on the agenda. So thank you for the invitation and also organizing this conference. So to answer your question, I think we have to go back to two critical moments when the welfare state really emerged, which was the end of the 19th century in Europe and, of course, the post-war period also in Europe. And I think that at those two critical moments, it's very clear that, you know, economic growth was very unstable and very weak, you know, at the end of the 19th century, when you have the first law ever of social protection of the welfare state, you know, decided by Bismarck on the question of labor accidents, and this sort of sharing, this sort of pooling of social risk between employer and employee. You don't have a lot of economic growth, you know, it's very unstable. You have a lot of crisis, financial crisis, and it's weak and unstable. And so it's quite clear that at this moment, you know, there is no connection with the welfare state and economic growth. It's not like the economic growth created or sustained the welfare state. It comes from a different logic. And what's interesting, I think, is that when economic growth is actually invented by Simon Kuznets, you have a lot of social injustice. So I would say that the welfare state is born out of the question of social injustice with not a lot of economic growth, while GDP is created in a context where you have a lot of social injustice. And I think that GDP is created in a sense to maybe mask or, you know, cloud the notion of social inequality by creating this idea of aggregate economic performance. And so, and if you look at the post-war period, it's also very clear. If you look at France, for instance, that, you know, what you have is debt. You don't have economic growth. I mean, France, if you read the memoirs of the General de Gaulle, you will see that France is completely ruined and is in ruins, actually, and that, you know, the ordonnances of the Sécurité sociale are not born of a period of prosperity. So the notion that the welfare state is dependent on economic growth for just existing and being sustained, I think is completely contradicted by history. And then the other point, if you fast forward to the current situation, is that there is a clear disconnection between economic growth on the one hand and household income on the other, and employment also. And so the notion that Bismarckian models or Beveridgean models, depend on economic growth to create income for households or employment relies on the notion that there is a clear connection between growth, income, and employment. And I think that this link is really completely dysfunctional at the moment. And my final point would be that not only can we say that the welfare state does not depend on economic growth, but actually economic growth destabilizes the welfare state. And it destabilizes the welfare state very clearly by accelerating ecological crisis, which translate into social risk. It's very clear, in 2022, that we have this huge problem. There were papers, published arguing that the real COVID toll is actually 18 million people dead in 2020 and 2021, and that, the normal functioning of the economic system creates or translates into 9 million people dead each year by pollution of the air and water. And this has social consequences. It has a huge cost for the welfare state. And the other point also, and the other driver of instability is the food system. And there is a clear connection between this dysfunctional food system that we have with very highly transformed, products that translate into diseases. And so I would say that, no, it's not clear to me that, economic growth is the prerequisite and the engine to finance the welfare state. On the contrary, I think that economic growth destabilizes the welfare state more and more clearly.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very, very interesting and well put question. Béla, I would actually turn back to you, if that's okay. Sure. So is it possible at all to decouple the emissions for GDP and income?
Thank you. I think it's a critical question, and what I think about it or say now based actually on data and what is happening in the real world is probably not the most popular thing to hear. I think we need to look at this really thoughtfully. I miss it actually in much of the big growth debate beyond GDP discussions, that this issue is not handled, what should I say, with proper care, with real good references, really looking at the data. It's a little bit of storytelling. So what is the point? What we see is, now at global level, 2021 was a huge rebound from the pandemic in terms of emissions. It was even a bigger rebound than what we had after the financial crisis. And the rebound in terms of emissions was higher than the emission reductions in 2020 due to the pandemic. And it was this is what the International Energy Agency report based on the newest data is showing, that actually this year or the last was the biggest recoupling between emissions and growth, because we are on a path of some decoupling. So this means that to detach emission, first of all, we are looking at emissions and pollution from economic activity, and from growth. So the expectation is that we can continue with economic growth, at the same time driving all the emissions, pollution, and all the terrible things that are the byproducts of human activity simply down, actually to zero. That is the plan. And so what we see is that it's not happening. So at least now it was a real bad year. And I have to say that even 2022 looks in a way global, that is not Europe, global, that we will still have increase in emissions. it will be a little bit less, or 1/3 of what would have been expected. And the difference is, apart from more renewables, which is one part, is the less growth. At global level, we won't have recession, but the growth expectation decreased. And this is contributing to the less emissions. So there is definitely there is a coupling. At the same time, I mean, it is difficult to say that it is not possible. I mean, Europe is the region where actually we definitely see decoupling, because it is, emissions have been down, okay, now only like 22%, but economic activity was 60% up in this period. So already that is an absolute decoupling. There are certain countries that are really doing well. So Sweden, for example, is really having had quite significant growth year over year, and one of the member states that has the deepest reduction in emissions, and not only territorial ones, but also consumption based. Okay, so it is possible. But still you can say that it is impossible to get down to zero. So I mean, you need not only absolute decoupling, but sufficient decoupling. Yeah, this is the notion. And that is indeed, and this is why it comes to say that there's no way it is possible to go down to net zero with having growth. And of course, we are talking about global level. What makes, but I think that we need both, because look at the extreme case, and I think this is not always put on the table. What would be the extreme case if we wanted to have, manage the emission cuts by reducing growth? Then we would have to go down by 100% to zero. Yeah, so this means zero GDP, zero. Of course, zero GDP wouldn't mean zero economic activity, because, but I mean, it is not a scenario, you know. So, but then how far you go down? Yeah, so. We want to go down to zero emissions. What does it mean? You go down to 80% GDP, so 20%, and then the rest you do with emission cut. So some sort of a combination. I mean, this is not so true. Yeah, how it is manageable, and it is, and of course, how the well-being indicators would provide some backing, how we have an economic activity that is not GDP, not measured by GDP, but so anyway, there are some questions around here. Yeah, thank you.
Tuuli, so I think it's been covered in the panels that at least I've attended to yesterday, but just en passant. So what is a sustainable welfare state in your opinion, and what are those characteristics that this welfare state should have?
Yes, thank you, Bianca, for first of all inviting me for this panel. It's nice to be here to discuss my favorite topics, and nice to answer this quite broad question. So maybe we start with broad definition of sustainable welfare states, and then I also would like to talk something more about the relationship between sustainable welfare state and economic growth, as I think it relates to this panel. So what is a sustainable welfare state? Maybe we start with the definition of sustainable welfare. So that could be understood as satisfying needs within planetary boundaries. That's very, very broad again. So sustainable welfare state should or would then be a state basically that functions within donut. So that it provides the social foundation, but also steers all human activities so that we don't exceed the planetary boundaries. Again, this is of course a very broad definition, but I think it's a good and useful kind of compass and frame that can be used also in empirical studies. For example, now recently in Living Within Limits project and Leeds, they published these articles that shows that when looking both these social foundation and ecological ceilings, there aren't any countries in the world currently that are within donuts. So therefore, we can say that sustainable welfare state is a policy goal rather than something that already exists. So we have to remember that not European welfare states are not sustainable as they are now. And so moving towards sustainable welfare states means radically reforming current welfare states, especially when taking seriously the degrowth transformation. So I am a social policy researcher as background. So I have to admit that sometimes it's quite difficult to take the position of somehow advocating or acknowledging the degrowth transformation and being a social policy researcher, because of course, social policy researcher, it would be easier to be in line with the social movements at demanding more money to social protection or social services. But then when we know the need to cut down the emissions and maybe despite the decoupling going on, still we need degrowth transformation. So the question then, of course, arises how to finance welfare states if economy is not growing. And I've really tried to navigate with this position between these positions as degrowth scholar and social policy scholar. And I've been asked this question so many times, and unfortunately I cannot answer you to have a really good answer, but maybe I want to emphasize 2 points that are quite common but so fundamental that I think it's worth repeating them. So first point is that economic growth is not a precondition for welfare states, but ecosystems and climate stability are. So there is a kind of priority order, and despite our cannot modify planetary boundaries to fit to finance welfare states that are expanding. So that is the priority order, and I hope if we get a better agreement with this point, then it's easier to argue that we need reforms in welfare state institutions and economic system and monetary reforms as well. So second point, again, often mentioned, but maybe worth repeating, is that the degrowth transformation is not about austerity, but about sufficiency. That's too often still that it's understood that we are actually talking something about something that is similar with austerity policies, but it's really important to remember that austerity policies after the financial crisis were related to certain power constellations that tried to save private capital, but also public sector funding in these given circumstances, whereas then degrowth transformation would be about providing sufficiency to all. And this is a difference. Sufficiency is about needs and avoiding overconsumption. It's about redistribution and really providing the social guarantee to all. And this is the point where I think that the degrowth transformation actually is better in line with the welfare state agenda, the traditional welfare state agenda that Eloi was talking about, than green growth trajectories, because green growth really leaves carbon and wealth inequalities untouched and unchecked, whereas degrowth transformation is about it talks about universal income protection, job guarantees, or universal basic services that can be organized and funded by more equal and less capital-centric provisioning systems. So that could be possible. To answer this, what is a sustainable welfare state, I think we should be honest while acknowledging that it's not possible to finance welfare state as it is without economic growth. We leave the public finance and service sector remaining as they are now. But this is different with the notion that it's not that this does not mean that we could not finance welfare provisioning in an ecologically sustainable economy. So maybe we have to get rid of some current institutions and really reform welfare states. But I think if someone argues that it's not possible to have well-being without economic growth, I think that's a lack of imagination. And that cannot be used as an excuse to delay the reformed.
Fantastic. Maybe in a few minutes, you can give us some concrete examples. I think it would be very, very helpful for us just to frame this a bit better. Paolo, back to the traditional welfare state literature. Do worlds of capitalism, world of welfare then overlap with the world of the social states, or they don't speak to each other, or are they different?
Well, thank you, Bianca, and once again, thank you for the invitation. It's my turn to say this. Well, together with Katharina Zimmermann from the University of Hamburg, we did ask ourselves if there was any link between the worlds of ecological states and the worlds of the welfare states. And we tried to run a cluster analysis, a very simple exercise. It was one of the first attempts, and we identified three variables that were going to tell us something about the outcomes in terms of the ecological state, and three variables that could tell us something about the outcomes of the welfare state. So environmental health was one, ecosystem vitality, and domestic material consumption. Again, we don't have time to go into the details, but just to give you an idea of what we did on the one hand, and on the other hand, we had the Gini unemployment and long-term unemployment, and we put them together. And what did we find? We did find something that has already been mentioned by Béla, by the way, that Sweden, the usual suspect, and Nordic countries are performing well with reference to both types of outcomes. But this is the only confirmation of the worlds of the welfare state literature, because then we have other 5 clusters that are much more blurred. Again, we do not have time to go into the details, but we find Central Eastern countries that are clustered together with Southern European countries. We have continental welfare states that are clustered with Southern European countries, and so on. So the picture is much more mixed. And as a first exercise, I think it can help us to single out not explanatory factors, but somehow to single out patterns that may require further exploration. And actually, what I think the current research agenda should be is to go into the details of the worlds of eco-social welfare states, or of sustainable welfare states, knowing that, just as Tuuli was reminding us, that we do not have a sustainable, 100% sustainable welfare state. We're far from that. But still, we do have some welfare states that, maybe without knowing it, this is what we do not know yet, looking at our research, have already considered also environmental consequences of the policies. But this is something currently being investigated by research. So we know, and we have some other pieces of research that somehow confirm our findings in terms of the Nordic countries, and this confirmed findings regarding other clusters. So it's still, I think, a relatively interesting field to just map out the outcomes. But I think that we really would need to go beyond that and look at the politics of social welfare states. And this is currently what I'm doing together with other colleagues, because that's where we understand more about the mechanisms to build a sustainable welfare state, and to understand better what are the links between the ecological or environmental friendly policies on the one hand, and the classic or traditional welfare state policies. So I think I'll stop here for the moment.
Fantastic, and I think we'll get to the politics in just a second. But before that, maybe Eloi, you could tell us a little bit more about if we can imagine a welfare state with growth, then what are the institutional dynamics at play, and also the political dynamics that are at play in this relationship?
Yeah, sure. I would like to go back for a minute to what Béla said about decoupling, because I think that it's really a debate that needs some clarification. Béla talked about storytelling, but I think that decoupling is storytelling. Decoupling economic growth from greenhouse gas emissions, as it is stated, for example, in the European Green Deal. The whole European Green Deal is really grounded on this notion that decoupling is an interesting notion. The point is decoupling what from what? If you are decoupling GDP, which is not a well-being indicator, from territorial emissions, which do not capture the reality of global carbon flows, then decoupling is completely pointless. Whether it's relative or absolute, it doesn't matter, because those two indicators are basically completely flawed. So if you use the right indicators, which is on the one hand not GDP but well-being indicators, and on the other material footprints, you see first that there is no decoupling for the European Union, basically, and second, then you can start working on interesting policies. But to base the notion that we have to achieve absolute decoupling between two flawed indicators, I think is really problematic when it comes to European policies. Now, I think in the chat there is a very interesting remark regarding the notion of decoupling, which is that the real decoupling that we should aim for is the decoupling between the welfare state and economic growth. And I think this is exactly right on target. This is the right decoupling that we should aim for. And it's not that hard if you consider the fact that you actually see a decoupling between economic growth and household income, and on the one hand, and economic growth and employment on the other, as I said earlier. Now, to go back to your question, Bianca, we are working with Tuuli on a paper about what we call the sufficiency state. And this is a paper that is being written in the context of a EU Horizon funded project, which is called TUBI, that Tuuli and others at Tampere University brilliantly managed to basically bring to life. And what we are doing in this, at least for the first part of the project, is try to have a sense of what would be the convergence points of the different streams of post-growth schools. And what we are trying to do with Tuuli is, building on our work on sustainable welfare state, is to try to say that sufficiency is actually the concept towards which the different post-growth schools or streams converged to. And if you take sufficiency as the key concept, then the idea that we need to move from the welfare state to the sufficiency state might mean that you need to revisit all the functions of the welfare state as they were designed by Richard Musgrave, allocation, stabilization, redistribution, in the light of sufficiency, using the IPCC definition in Working Group 3 RR6 reports, but maybe trying to better sort out sufficiency on the one hand, which is a state, and sufficiency policies which help achieve this goal. And the notion is that welfare, welfare was in a sense built on the notion that the limitation was freedom, was a political limitation, that a lot of, let's say, elites enjoy education, health, but not the rest of the people. And so welfare was, in a sense, to free European population from this limitation of, let's say, political regimes that would not allow them to access welfare. But now the limitation is completely different. It's not about, unbound welfare, it's about limited well-being, and so hence the notion of sufficiency. So the first thing, to answer directly your question, Bianca, is to maybe shift from the notion of welfare to the notion of sufficiency. And if you look again, I'm sorry, I'm French, at the Ordonnance de Sécurité Sociale, I was really surprised to see that at the center of this text, of this founding text of the European welfare state, you have the notion that what needs to be protected is the capacité de gain. In other words, the monetary ability, or the ability to gain monetary income. And this is what is supposed to be protected by social protection, which is really strange. And so you see here that we need to move to another notion, which might be sufficiency. And then, once again, you need to revisit all the functions of the welfare state. At least this is what we try to do in the paper, all the functions of the welfare state. And so I would give the example, of course, of allocation functions. So Musgrave says, once again, Musgrave says that, the welfare state provides allocations, redistribution, and stabilization. Allocation means that there is a clear market failure in allocation of resources. And the key notion here is the notion of social saving. We are always talking about, we need needs new social spending. But what about social saving? What about the fact that we could save huge amounts of actual spending if we build our cities differently, if we take care of air pollution, if we foster health, if we invest in prevention. In France, prevention spending is 1.5% of all the spending that is being done on healthcare. This is just dismal. And of course, with this amount of spending, you do not have the means to prevent diseases from happening. So what you end up doing is devoting more and more resources to diseases that you do not prevent and that you actually accelerate, for instance, with ecological crisis and the food system. So this is the sort of notions that we are working at, the sort of institutional changes that we are offering in this paper.
Thank you very much. And perhaps Tuuli, I think you will expand on this a little bit.
Yes, or not, or rather to avoid repeating the arguments that Eloi nicely already presented, I maybe would like to say something more about the concrete eco-social policies that have been already presented in the ongoing research. But actually, talking about the political mobilization that is needed now and institutional changes, how to get this kind of sufficiency state and change the welfare state institutions. I also would like to revisit the history of welfare state, as Eloi also did in his first comment, because I think it's fascinating to understand that we wouldn't have now maternity leaves or unemployment benefits or whatever public services without social movements and class struggles. And here yesterday there was a lot of discussion on capitalism, and I think also the history of welfare state and the roots of social policy, as we heard, they are in this kind of class struggle and social movements. The working class started to demand better living and working conditions, and then the capitalist class responded to this in fear of more communist revolution. They were then ready to provide social services, and they were ready to increase taxation. And it was a political compromise. It's a kind of historical political compromise that was done at that time. And I think that it's something that we could now keep in mind, that this kind of political mobilization will be needed again and again, new kind of political compromises. And I think trade unions could have a big role in this struggle as well, as they had in the history or when building welfare states. And it's good to also be honest that there will be losers and losses in this transformation as well. As is already somehow prevalent in the notion of just transition, and when talking about the Green New Deal, not so much maybe in the context of European Green Deal, but this kind of, so it will be a struggle to build welfare states. But what are the institutional solution or policy solutions? I also often heard argument is that the policymakers say that they lack alternatives, that we don't have any good policy ideas to implement. But I think this is also a little bit like lack of imagination or lazy approach, or then it's a sign that the policymakers or civil servants don't follow science, which makes me a little bit sad. But because as a scholar, I do see that there is kind of blooming research in the field of post-growth sustainable welfare states or eco-social policies. Papers are ongoing and have been published, as Paolo also described one brilliant paper. So there are well elaborated ideas of eco-social policies, and just to name few. So with eco-social policies, we mean policies that explicitly try to pursue both ecological and social sustainability. Not so that we have green transition and then we try to compensate the social impacts, but deliberately try to design the policies in such a way that they really support sustainable welfare. So, for example, maybe public procurements. These are really reformist ideas. Public procurements can be implemented in a way that it supports decarbonization. This is something that is already taking place in Finland quite strongly. well-being budgets as implemented in New Zealand are brilliant, I think, because they show what are the investments, kind of eco-social investment. They are more transparent than current budget procedures. Then green vouchers, for example, have been proposed as a means to prevent energy poverty or fuel poverty. They could also be used to support public transportation use. And then maybe a carbon dividend is also one example of eco-social policy, to allocate carbon tax revenues maybe more equally or at least universally. Or then we could introduce a social dividend to be paid on the resource extraction, for example. So, and there are plenty other examples. And I think those are very reformist, as I said. They are easy to implement without further delay. Can I say so? If we only want to. I think that there is a question of political will and mobilization.
Thank you very much. And I'll go back to the political will with you, Paolo, in just a second. I've seen a few raised hands, and we have just a few more questions scheduled for the panel, but I promise that you will have enough time for all of your questions at the end. So Paolo, political dynamics. What are they, especially if we are looking at eco-social policies?
Right. Well, it's clearly we have two paths or two key actors that may intervene. One is the world of social movements that has been referred to. I'll come back to it in a few minutes. And then the other is institutions, and green public procurement and other policies that have been adopted so far do go in this direction to a certain extent, but as Tuuli was rightly saying, they're reformists to a certain extent. On the social movement side, and this is why I think this event is really so important, because having the trade unions backing up, unions in research institute backing up a new vision is very important, because it sets possibly new alliances. And we have another panel, unfortunately, we cannot attend, that is focusing on the alliances. And this is really crucial in order to really have a political dynamic that can be a positive one. So social movements, not only do we have trade unions, of course, but we have degrowth movements. We have, together with other colleagues, we label the sustainable community movement organizations that work at a very local level. And there we have radical examples, not only reformist examples, but we have radical examples of changes, transition towns, time banks that somehow offer solutions that are not monetized, that are solutions that can be somehow adopted without following the logic, the classic logic of state benefit provision. So at the local level, I think we have lots of very innovative examples that are not easy to scale up. One of the issues in the sustainable community movement organization studies is, how do you scale up such positive ways of dealing, for example, with the food system? This was raised by Eloi, and that's very important. As we know, the food system has a very important carbon footprint. So I do think that in order to not only map what's going on, but also somehow contribute to the agenda setting, because this is what actually is happening. We're not yet in at the end of the policy formulation, talking in policy analysis terms. We are at the end of the agenda setting and developing some policies, and some have been adopted. So we do have some examples, but they're still very limited and they're very reformist. So in order to back up and to make even more creative the current agenda setting, I think that we should really look at the great number of innovations that we have at the local level, and try to find ways to scale them up. And in order to scale them up, you need bigger social movements to a certain extent, or bigger associations that come in and that somehow detail the various elements that need to be part of a radically different approach. Let's go back to the definition of welfare state: socialization of social risks. Let's start with a basic definition. And within the social risks today, we also have environmental risks. Then we can talk about growth. Although, and I would conclude on this, I somehow think we should really put aside the issue of the link, as many others have already said, simply because growth can be put into the equation, but it's it can be selective growth, it can be alternative growth, but growth is not the term we want to use anymore. Prosperity, well-being, a completely different way of reading economic data could help us in doing something that Serge Latouche called decolonizing the imaginary, which is, I find, a wonderful way of putting it. And this is exactly what we're doing here. And this is why it's so important that it's not, as it happened 10 years ago in Venice, when there was the degrowth conference, maybe some of you were there, where it was fascinating, it was very creative, very innovative, but it was limited in terms of an impact. Here, 10 years later, we had another conference in Venice with the degrowth movement, very interesting, but still, it's not reaching the agenda, the formulation phase that easily. These, I think, conferences instead, these debates, are much more capable of doing this, simply because they're supported by many other actors, including the ones that were very innovative 10, 15 years ago. And we have to say this very clearly by identifying degrowth as something important to pursue. So it's a moment, it's an aggregation moment now that I find very, very promising.
Thank you very much. And I think this is a good segue for the question that I prepared for Béla. So what role do trade unions have in this process, if they have a role? Of course, we believe that they do, otherwise we wouldn't have this event here, but yeah, this is my question for you.
Yes, definitely. Before coming to trade unions, I think there is one central element of this discussion that was not yet mentioned, that is inequality. That has been the poison of our societies for decades and decades. And there is an interpretation to say that somehow inequality is intrinsically related to growth, because this is a capitalist growth model that is just regenerating inequality ever and ever. And beside the planetary limits, this is the second argument that this growth model is completely off. But we less tried to address. We couldn't manage to tackle inequality in the last 50 years with having economic growth. And now we want to tackle fundamentally inequality without growth. So it's at least not something of without ambition. So it's really a big thing to do. And you need the institutional capacity for that. So this is where I still think we need some further thinking. After that, coming then to trade unions. Trade unions are central actors and have been, as Paolo already said, playing a central role in fighting for the welfare state and in a way also establishing, depending on countries, but with massive historical contribution to what we have as a welfare state. But this welfare state is based on the capitalist, extractionist, material intensive growth model. And that is completely clear that this growth model is for the history books. Yeah, so this we need a paradigm change, a fundamental. Yeah, so this means everything we do, and that needs its production, it is consumption, it is mobility, it is really everything. It is complete behavioral change, and then how in this equation trade unions can contribute. Well, it is not straightforward. Trade unions are very different, and what we also see, well, okay, there was a distinguished, two main types were distinguished by Richard Hyman, the business unionism and the social movement unionism. So the daily business union in the companies and kind of big part of the system and co-managing the system. to gain more out of it, yeah, and that is really like redistribution within the system, and there was emerging social movement unionism that was going beyond membership, beyond the particular interests, beyond the, well, local plant level, you know, the matter there is for the miners union and all these kind of particular interests that are very deeply entrenched in the system. But looking beyond that, there was a social movement unionism that was emerging in the decades and that was taking up environmental issues. Well, of course, health and safety has always been a core the interest of trade unions, but it's a very limited one. And actually, when looking at case studies, we also saw that there is a cost dependency here because trade unions are really strong on local environmental issues, but not on the broader issues. Because so this is where so it's the diverse landscape and also depending on well different levels, national or sector and regional levels, plant level. It's all really different. But what I still want to say as a central challenge that trade unions have really became actors. Well, of course, they have different strengths in different countries and in different branches, but still they have. And they became kind of agents of, well, change. That would be the good thing, but agents to manage restructuring, for example, at plant level, regional level. They did a lot, and there are a lot of successful examples how trade unions were actively taking part in social dialogue. But the pattern of this was that those industrial changes, let it be technological or business based, were always serving the profit interest. And the trade unions were actually fighting, well, against changes, for example, when the companies were making decisions on relocating labor for in sake of cheaper production in terms or lower environmental standards and so on and so on. So this kind of under the globalization, these restructuring processes, trade unions were very fundamentally questioning the rationale of that change. So they were fighting against it. They said, well, you have profits enough here and you just want to move away because of higher profits. So they were kind of trying to block. Some of the changes that are taking place now in the green transformation are similar because there are about reorganizations, there are about skills, there are completely new setups of production systems. And the nature of the change is similar, but this time the trade unions cannot say that we are blocking this change because this change is not for the profit, it is for humanity. And this is kind of an interesting conflict, how trade unions get in terms with them, how to become really active part of change that accepts change. That is really important, accepts change and promotes change. And that is really difficult in a environment that is actually hostile to change. And that is what I think it is one central element of this social state, beyond all the functions you mentioned, that it should be a state that is facilitating change, make change possible and not risky, because nowadays, if we look around, change is a real risk. I mean, most young people would like to be working in public administration because that is secure, because all the rest is insecure. This is not a good word, so that favors change. So I mean, and there are really big dilemmas for trade unions.
Very much, Béla.
Yeah.
So I have a last few sets of questions. If I could ask our panelists to be concise so that we can have all the time for the discussion later. Well, I have a question for you. So if we are imagining to go beyond growth, what effect will this have specifically on the world of work?
I will answer this, but first I would like to go back to the point, very important point that Paolo was making, which is the point about the GDP paradox. How is it that for the last 150 years, we have had brilliant criticism of GDP, and yet GDP is so strong and seems just, so powerful. And I think he's right on target when he says that it's because this criticism has not been about how GDP. So people argue that it's because GDP is such a brilliant statistical indicator and it has such strong statistical quality. And I think on the contrary, the statistical flaws are showing, in a way that's really unprecedented. I think the real strength of GDP is that it is embedded in our institutions in Europe. And so I would really love to see, for this post-growth conference of May 2023, a reflection on how GDP is embedded in our institution. What we are trying to do today with this panel is to understand how growth is embedded in the notion of the welfare state, while it shouldn't be. And it's also the case, as Tuuli was mentioning, for public finances. And I think if you just look at the welfare state and public finances and just reflect on how we can dislodge GDP and growth from those two critical institutions, I think we could make some real progress and eventually solve the GDP paradox. Now, I would also like to say that one way to go, beyond growth, without growth, is just to change the economic mindset. We are very much in the 20th century economic mindset. And we are, so take, for instance, the notion of inflation today. So inflation is understood to be just a macroeconomic problem about, monetary flows. And so central banks are going to solve it. And this is very much, the Keynesian economic mindset of the 20th century. But inflation is just a social ecological reality. Inflation is, on the one hand, 40% rise in energy prices, and on the other hand, 10% rise in food prices. And of course, the two are connected, and the dependency on fossil fuels. So inflation is really a social ecological problem today. And solving inflation is not about rising interest rates. It's about addressing the two most important questions that we have in Europe, which is on the one hand, energy poverty, and on the other, food insecurity. And you can see that you can, deal with the return of inflation with just a mindset of, this Keynesian full employment, economic growth, social progress, sort of, a nice feedback loop, or you can deal with inflation with the real social ecological approach, which is on the one hand, dependency on fossil fuels, and on the other, energy poverty and food insecurity. And if you are dealing with inflation with the wrong mindset, you are going to make things worse, which is exactly what we are about to make as a mistake, in Europe and in the US, which is to create a recession because we don't understand the true social ecological nature of inflation. So I've not answered your question at all, Bianca, but I'm sorry for that.
We'll come back in the questions from the audience, don't worry. Do you mind if I switch to Tuuli, or there's anything else that you would like to say, Eloi?
No, I'm good, thank you.
Okay, so Tuuli, if we are imagining a new world of work, we have been told that we need all this new set of active labor market policies to retrain the workers for this new world of work that is coming beyond us. Then what is this paradigm? How should it look like? And do you think there is any change that should happen in terms of unemployment and employment policies?
Yes, for sure, there are changes that needs to happen. And maybe when you said that we need to retrain people, that's necessary for the green transition now, but that's different than the activation paradigm that has taken place in the welfare states. And I think that's problematic for several reasons. Activation paradigm actually enforces job seekers to take whatever jobs despite their environmental impacts or their harmful impacts on mental health or whatever well-being, harmful impacts on well-being in general. And it doesn't enhance people to choose meaningful jobs. What is needed in this current situation. And Eloi said that you didn't touch upon the word of work. I think we have to talk about work. It's very central in this transformation because labor market is related to emissions, resource use, also to inequality, to well-being, our needs of self-realization, our needs of protection, etc. But how to change? Degrowth literature is providing this kind of more radical approach that it's about liberating ourselves from labor markets. And I think I'm sometimes surprised to see that trade unions are not following this. Trade unions at the moment are really stuck with the quite established understanding of paid work. They want to protect what is achieved. They want to increase the standard of living, at least that I've seen in Finland. Whereas it could be about decommodification, about liberating ourselves from alienating work and providing some kind of equal possibilities to participation for all and equal means to sustain ourselves. So I think we have to rethink what is work. We have to have a broader notion of work, not so clear distinction between paid and unpaid work. We have to appreciate care work and whatever. But maybe again, I can provide a more reformist solution. It's called participation income. Well, that could be implemented within the given welfare state setting, I would say. It could be a way to change unemployment benefit structure so that people who are, for example, long-term unemployed could earn a little bit more when participating in socially and ecologically meaningful activities. Those can be decided together collectively. What are those needs that things that needs to be done anyway in care sector, in employment, in environmental recycling sector, for example, or in enhancing biodiversity, protecting nature, so people could get possibilities to participate, and it could be also a way to somehow help alleviate the working life problems that people could get out from mentally straining jobs that they find unmeaningful and stressful.
Thank you very much, Tuuli. I would like to move on to the supranational level that we haven't really touched on so far. And as we are in Brussels, we can't not touch upon the European context, the EU. And we've heard this concept of just transition that has been brought forward also many times throughout the panels. So Paolo, my question for you is the concept of just transition compatible with the Beyond Growth framework, or it's not?
In principle, I think it is. The point is how we define the just component of the transition. So we can have a very mild definition and reformist, or we can have a much more radical definition of justice, thinking not only of the transition as just, but as social justice at the heart of the transition, which would be a very different way to see the notion of justice in its context. So with this respect, the European Union level so far has somehow changed slightly the reading of the eco on the one hand and the social on the other. The European Green Deal has many limitations for sure, but at least for the first time, it has some references to both worlds of the ecological aspect or component and the social one. So it's going in the right direction, very timidly going in the right direction. This is why I think we really need to go back to one of the previous questions, that is, how do we make this happen in a more effective way, in a more rapid way? Because 2019, we had the launch of the European Green Deal, then COVID-19 created another we do not even need to mention. But now is the time to really push forward in terms of all the things we're saying. So the just transition can be something that we can hold on and use in order to set the agenda in a much more ambitious way. It's not easy, of course, because still the reading of the European Union institutions, we also heard about this yesterday, is, if you wish, very, especially within the Commission, it's still very classic in terms of growth, in terms of GDP, in terms of social protection, only in terms of GDP expenditure. We don't have time to go in this direction as well, but this is another thing we have to put aside, not consider social expenditure in terms of GDP, because otherwise we are in the trap, we're putting ourselves in the trap. So to conclude, I do think that the European Union level is the level where these kinds of debates have to be made. The just transition is a good anchor. It's a great anchor that has to be used very wisely by a new coalition that cannot but have the trade unions at the center, since they're a part of it, and the numbers are, of course, very important. But it has to be a constellation of actors that makes the just transition radically just, and not simply, a word like many others that we heard in a number of strategies: smart, soft, open, whatever, and it really never delivered. This is the time where we need to deliver.
Thank you very much. Béla, I actually have the mirror question for you. So is the just transition a good anchor, or is it not?
It is not, it is now. I mean, so if we look at the current reality, we are far, far away. Even if we are looking for a concept of just transition that is this integrative and comprehensive, we have to look very carefully, but certainly the ILO guidelines in 2015 were a little bit kind of setting this. Of course, it's vague because it is not really going into concrete policies, but was absolutely stressing this. So 2 points that actually Paolo was already saying, that climate, social and environmental policies need to be integrated. It should be a comprehensive framework. It is not that we have one and then we have an additional correction element somewhere, but it needs to be because all these and actually any inequality that is related to climate and environmental hazard, but also the transition, they are so much interrelated with each other, from housing to mobility and that the only thing it can work that is integrated from the outset, and it is really what happened in Europe. Of course, it's a formidable task. It's not easy. So what we have actually at European level is that the just transition component was always additional, decorative almost, and coming after. It was already a big thing that the European Green Deal went beyond the pure declarations. So with the Fit for 55 package, it is really hardcore. Yeah, so we have the policies from industry to food renovation, very concrete and well, even if not sufficient. But what came as just transition was a little bit of compensation. So first the just transition fund with its very much reduced resources and a completely limited scope, because it's about cold regions. Yeah, actually about cold regions. is nothing really like a corporate. And then came the second moment when in 21 the policies, hardcore policies, and particularly the emission trading system reform with DS2 was put on the table, and then suddenly they realized, oh, we need a little bit of compensation because otherwise it will be too hard. So this is where the social climate fund was coming into play, which will be implemented from 2025. But that is a pure correction measure of the extension of the ETUI. It is not adding anything more. And then after that came the recommendation of the Commission to the Council on kind of nice talk with fair transition and making it actually, there are some hints there that social dialogue is important and this and that that are, but it's well, it is, we are absolutely far away from what we would really need to have an integrated conversion if we really take it seriously. And by the way, last word, sorry, this current energy crisis and inflationary environment, it is really a stress test for both the European Green Deal and the European social model, if we have anything like that, because it's Eloi was mentioning that, oh yeah, inflation is well. It's a different. We have it in a different context because it is related to fossil energy. It is practically a fossil energy inflation, yes, but if we want to tackle the core of this as very clear, that complete phase down of fossil energy, so we have to build up a complete different energy landscape and the mobility. But how long does it take? I mean, at least 10 years. And what we do in these 10 years, and what those people do who have no means to invest into nice houses with zero carbon, with heat pumps and all that nice things, and have a Tesla in the garage, is not everybody can do that. And at least 10 years we have to survive. So we need more just part for that, but in a way so that it is not conflicting the climate objective. And it's a very, very difficult situation.
Thank you very much. I think actually you have time now to open for further questions. I remember the questions that were the hand that was up before, so would still like to take the question. I think I would take 3 or 4, and then we can see if we have time for a second round as well. If you could also say who you are and you know, where you work, that would be fantastic.
My name is Lars Borking. I'm a Danish filmmaker. And I come from one of the Nordic countries that actually transformed quite a lot, and where there's a very strong narrative that decoupling is real, it's happening, we can do it. And within the Social Democrats of Denmark and all of the trade unions, this narrative is very strong. So one of my questions is, how do you challenge this narrative in a Danish or Nordic context, where we've at least seen some of it? Is your main arguments that we are calculating in a wrong way, we're not looking in material footprint, or is your main argument that we're not looking into our consumption abroad, or what is kind of the main, where do I find good analysis of why this narrative is actually not real storytelling, as you say, Eloi? That the welfare state has to change. We cannot have equally as big a welfare state. It's dependent on the extractivist regime. But isn't that one of our main problems, that we have had a unions that fought for their members to better their material lives, and now we are looking into a transformation where unions should be part of a transformation to kind of take production down. I mean, the things you're talking about, I hardly can see trade unionists in Denmark fighting for these well-being budgets, green vouchers, etc. The working class to demand that in strikes. So don't we face that we should that we should be much more specific in what's in it for the working class? Eloi is talking about, you know, the inflation. In Denmark, we have house prices that are very, very difficult for working class people to live in the cities. Don't we need to look much more specific into the demands of how to decommodify the economy? Why is that important for union members?
Thank you very much. I think you also had your.
Yes, thank you. Marguerite from the European Environmental Bureau. I'm wondering how we could finance this new sufficiency state. And I wonder what role modern money theory has to play in all of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, hi, my name is Lasse. I'm not representing an organization right now. I'm just here on my own. My question is, you talked about making the switch from a welfare state to a sufficiency state. And obviously that entails a lot of breaking up private property relationships and social hierarchies. And I'm wondering, when we talk about going from a welfare state to a sufficiency state, do we have to ask the question, is the liberal state compatible with the goals that we are demanding? Because it was mentioned earlier before that also like the GDP is more or less written down in the constitutions of European economies. So is the liberal state actually compatible with the demands that we're making right now?
Yeah, my question, the Loudest Foundation. My question is around the just transition definition, because from my very limited experience, I don't work in trade unions, is that people can get very focused on transitioning jobs. And when the conversation becomes wider around providing people with decent housing or other things, they will say, no, that's not part of a just transition. So are you proposing broadening the definition, or I'm just curious?
I think we can. You're right. Go ahead. If you could keep your question very short, because we only.
This must be in democracy, because when you, the trade unions, for which I'm working 10 years, to change the mind and to offer the meta-communist and post-capitalism era, the egoist movement, the pan-European and Mediterranean regional movement, which is working with citizens' assemblies, direct democracy, science and ecology and arts. So when the audience will become citizens, because you follow the system, the oligarchic system approach, and the audience is not an audience, they are citizens equivalent to you. They are educated, they know how to treat, so much time must be devoted to the dialogue with the citizens, which is the basic element of a true democracy. When you change this in your minds, you will have the change. So offering to the public and to what Eloi very well mentioned, his analysis was very good, but I'll have to keep the workers on a deeper level of knowledge. Everything, any kind of welfare depends not from money, but from energy. If we have the energy, we create the elements for another approach, so that if we want to go to another level of an automatic robotic society, where the citizens' assemblies will control the robotic operation, we need energy. Without energy, we cannot do any kind of things, either insufficient or whatever. The taxation system which you, the scholars, are proposing is based on the capitalistic point of view. The capitalistic point of view is on the backs of the citizens, the taxpayers. So this is not, from our approach, is not indicated. There are other solutions. Ending my contribution to the workers, which they are not existing. I have mentioned the 10 last years, they are not going to exist in the future. The workers in the Marxistic, Leninistic meaning and the capitalistic, because the robots already are working on this. We have the technology. As I'm working on the progressive technology, I know this, but they don't implement because they don't know what to do with you. So the trade unions, they have to change their oligarchic approach and enter to a more democratic, as it was, and again against the party system. The party system is destroying the workers' money. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we could go around the table and shall we start with Eloi that is afar,
Sure.
and then we come back to the room?
Sure.
Yes,
We just have 10 minutes, so if you could be quite concise, that would be fabulous.
Yeah, I'm very happy to see this panel turn into an actual social revolt, and I'm very happy to be remote. So I really, good luck to the panelists with the mad crowd that is going to go after them. Just to answer on the first question, which was how do we debunk the decoupling narrative on that is going on in Nordic countries. I think that someone who spoke at this conference, Jason Hickel, did a great job arguing about the dark side of the Nordic model and actually writing a paper on how you can just, take HDI index and show that they are not reflecting the true ecological impact of Nordic countries. And it triggered actually a reform of the HDI. And so I would urge you to look at this video, which is called The Dark Side of the Nordic Model, and then you can find answers on how to debunk this decoupling narrative. The other question I wanted to answer was the notion that we need to finance things. So it's very much the notion at the core of the ecological transition. So right now in France, you have a sort of a sudden awakening of people saying, oh, it's going to cost a lot of money. So economists have been arguing for the last 30 years that ecological crisis will cost nothing. That was the premise of all the work of Bill Nordos, that we have the means to cover the cost of climate change, is going to cost nothing. And now economists are arguing that it's going to cost too much. I would say it's the same argument. So it's not about financing anything. It's about changing the way we think about things. So we do not need to finance the welfare state. We need to understand how the welfare state was created and why it was created, and how, just social savings can be the key to this thing. And there was a great paper in ecological economics, and I think the first line was, ecological transition is not about a great investment plan. It's something else. We need to change attitudes, behaviors, institution, etc. So I think we need to change the mindset. It's not about financing anything. It's about reforming our societies.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. And I think we can come back to the room. So we go Paolo first, and then we
Sure.
continue.
Yeah, I think also the questions prove that we need to continue this debate. We need to find innovative ways also of getting panels together, simply because I think that every single person in the room has not only stories to tell, but also has research to share and examples to share. So I really think that it should be the beginning of an ongoing debate that should not happen once every 6 months, but should really happen more often. This said, I fully subscribe to what Eloi was saying with reference to the costs of the transition, the just transition. This is, of course, a relevant question, but we need really to find, first of all, the ways through which we can really create the foundations of this new reading of reality, because this is what it is. Then we will consider the costs, but again, social savings and many other innovative ways of producing welfare or well-being or prosperity. We'll find the right words. And again, we may have many different words also in the room here. But I do think that if you change the imaginary, you can also find innovative solutions in terms of sustainability in a very radical sense. Again, not simply sustainable as greenwashing, because sustainability and sustainable has become an adjective that can be attached to anything, right? So if we take the just transition in a very radical way, the justice, ecological and social justice point has to be underlined and has to be at the center of policy making. This is why I do think that it's not only a question of debates, but it's also a question of proposals and examples and attempts to see how this can actually be realized. And of course, in various countries, in various local levels, we'll find maybe different pathways. But as long as we share the new imaginary, as long as we share the reading that we have to go beyond GDP, but seriously, not only with words, but actively trying to find alternatives, then I think we're all going to go in the right direction. And this entails not only research and new indicators, this is number one, but also strategy building in terms of coalition setting. And this is, of course, very political, if you wish, but it's what we learn also from research. Why is it that so many good words, why is it that the Club of Rome in 1972 never really managed to have what they said 50 years ago in the decision-making? Simply because there was no grand social and political coalition that was supporting that reading. And this is the time for that, I guess.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for very great and broad questions. First, I want to address, coming from a Nordic country, I'm very familiar with the narrative you described, that this actually is a win-win situation, that it's a great opportunity for our country, that we are doing well, we can decarbonize, and it will bring more business opportunities. But for that, and I think Eloi also referred to this dark side of our Nordic countries, I'm the one who then tried to say that, okay, we cannot continue as we are, because we have produced our well-being at the cost of other people living in other countries. We have created our well-being at the cost of other species, and we have created our well-being at the cost of future generations. So we are not doing well in many ways, and we have to be aware of the resource use, not just emissions, but also resource use. Natural resource use should be decoupled, and that's a big challenge. It's an enormous challenge. We can't do that. We have to dematerialize, and we have to be aware of this global unequal exchange, that we are part of the colonial economy still, so we have to acknowledge that. And then what are the trade unions fighting for? I'm aware that the situation is different, but it's not really, if we understand the impacts of climate change or climate and biodiversity crisis, if we take seriously how it will actually really cause diverse impacts in our security, in our stable livelihood, in our stable everyday life. I think trade unions should be marching for security, for a stable life, for equality, for needs, and for wealth tax, for example. That could be something that is concrete, because wealth tax is an eco-social policy instrument, knowing that the emissions and resource use increase along with the income level. So I would see that we have more gaining than losing in the end. So that we can say for people. And how to finance sufficiency state? Is there something to learn from modern monetary theory? I knew that this question will come. I think it's very important, and I a little bit disagree with Eloi that it's not only the way how we talk about financing that's important as well, but it's really a real life problem. There are municipalities and governments that are trying to finance their expenditure. That's about schools, and it's about nurseries, and about hospitals. So we have to be aware how to finance, but the money is there. We can redistribute the money that is already on the market. We have means to issue more money. We should maybe rethink the balance, or we should think the balance between private and public money. Government could have more bigger role in issuing money. And we could use complementary currencies. So financing is also a question of imagination in this sense, but it's crucial. And then is sufficient state, liberal state, is the notion of liberal state compatible with sufficiency state. This is also very important question that in the literature that I'm following, in sustainable welfare state or eco-social policy literature or in green transition literature, there is now more and more discussion that we need a strong regulative state. We need a very active state to enhance the investments that are required. That we are not fine with liberal state. But then also, I would say that we need enabling state or supportive state, as Béla said, enabling state towards community economies or diverse economies. That we need a state that is really acknowledging other actors as well, and state that is not. It has coercive power, and we need legislation, but we also need commoning. So both, hopefully. I don't know how, but this is my answer. And then about transition, hopefully you can answer.
Yes, thank you. But I quickly say a few words. Well, what I think is really important in this debate. So we are talking about deep behavioral change and really kind of fundamental change that is necessary. And then we talk about the enhanced role of the state and eco-social state. And it's a good question, actually, how competent is this with liberal democracy or liberal state or democracy? And I think this is a real hard question, and it needs much more thoughts about that, because if we believe that an enlightened dictator will do all these changes, well, this is not how societies work, and so it's kind of a risky. What we see is that democracy is not always so. For example, just an example, when the German Green Party was putting up just one one vegetarian day a week, and in school managed to change a little bit food behavior, and were completely erased at the next elections. In Germany, you cannot even talk about the speed limit on the motorway. It's on a tema. There are really big changes in policy. How you get there? On just transition, yes. I mean, there is actually no definition. I mean, it's interpretation, but there is a concept. So I would say that the labor market transitions are core. Tackling the distributional effect, so that is the price, energy price, for example, energy poverty, transport poverty, and all that that comes with the transition, and then there is the affordability and accessibility to low carbon pollution, which is very tricky. But all this is in our European context, because this is a reminder, and this is a limitation also for European policies, that in the European interpretation, just transition is about managing the transformation. But it is not about the global context. It's not about global north and global south, the exploitative, extractive ways of doing things. It's not about loss and damage, and it's not about actually nothing. It is often there are confused terms. Climate justice was coming from one tradition, and sometimes it is associated with the transition. It is not exactly. So the European just transition practice is absolutely not addressing issues of climate change. So I mean, there are limitations and maybe. Okay. Thanks.
I think this is all the time that we have today, but hopefully at least the most of you that are in the room, you can have maybe a small chat with the speakers and among yourselves during the coffee break. And for the numerous people that has been able to join us online, thank you so much for the entire duration of the time. And a big thank you to all of you for having
I
I was
think
happy.
it's
I
more or
didn't have
less.
to.
Yeah, I think that's more or less.